The sound of a door being violently kicked open echoed through the neighborhood. The harsh commands of men shouting, "You're in violation!" filled the air as an unexpected storm of anger and authority hit the doorstep of an ordinary house. This wasn't just any visit. It was the beginning of something much bigger, something that would shake an entire community. But what were they really after? A broken rule? Or something far darker, far more personal? And what happens when an innocent man, tired of being silenced, calls in his own kind of reinforcements? The story you're about to hear is not just about a violation. It's about justice, power, and a group of warriors willing to risk everything to make sure the truth is heard. In a quiet suburban neighborhood nestled between manicured lawns and white picket fences lived a man who never asked for trouble. But trouble had a way of finding him. John Miller, a former Army SEAL, was a man of few words, preferring to live in peace. He had seen enough chaos in his lifetime to last him several lifetimes. His time in the military had shaped him, taught him discipline, sacrifice, and above all honor. He'd moved to this quiet neighborhood hoping for a fresh start, a place where he could leave the past behind, where he wouldn't be judged by the scars he carried, both physical and emotional. His house was modest, tucked away, in the corner of the cul-de-sac, a haven he thought would shield him from the noise of the world. But it wasn't just his past that followed him. It was something much more insidious, something that seemed to have a hand in everything, everywhere. The HOA, or Homeowners Association, was something John never really paid much attention to, until they started paying attention to him. A small infraction here, a misplaced garbage can there, minor offenses at first, but enough to warrant a warning letter. And then, things escalated. A knock on his door one evening turned into an unexpected confrontation. The HOA officers, as they called themselves, barged in without a proper explanation, demanding to know why he wasn't adhering to the community rules. John stood there, surprised by their presence and their attitude, trying to stay calm. But the shouting, the condescending remarks, something about their tone didn't sit right. Was it just about rules? Or was there more to this? Was he being singled out, treated differently because of who he was? Someone who had seen the worst of humanity, a man of color in a predominantly white community? As the officers stormed off, leaving behind nothing but tension and confusion, John could feel a storm brewing. But this time he wouldn't stand alone. He'd seen enough injustice in his life to know when to fight back, and this time he had the perfect people by his side. The next few days were filled with a quiet but persistent unease. John tried to ignore the feeling that something bigger was at play here, but the truth was undeniable. He had been warned by the HOA officers, but it didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a declaration, an assertion of power. They were making an example out of him. As John mulled over the encounter, it wasn't just the rules that bothered him. It was the tone, the condescending attitude that seemed to linger. He'd seen this kind of treatment before in the military, on the streets in various parts of the world. But it hit harder now, in the place he thought would offer him safety. John wasn't naive. He knew when someone was looking down on him, judging him not for his actions, but for the color of his skin. It had happened before, and it had happened in ways that were far worse than what the HOA was doing now. But something about the condescending smirk of the officer, the one who had been the loudest, made John's blood boil. John was no stranger to fighting for what's right, but he had fought wars, seen enough bloodshed, enough loss. He wasn't looking for conflict. But what could he do when someone stepped on his peace, on his dignity, and tried to silence him simply because of his identity? That night, John reached out to the only people he knew could help him, his old SEAL team. These weren't just any friends. They were brothers, bound by experience and loyalty. They knew the struggle, the fight against unfair treatment, and the lengths one must go to when forced to stand their ground. He made the call brief and to the point. I need help. The HOA is coming after me and I'm tired of this nonsense. I want them to know they messed with the wrong guy. Within hours, his former team members had rallied. They weren't just bringing legal advice or muscle. They were bringing their own kind of justice. These were men who had fought for their country, who had seen the darkest sides of the world and come back stronger. They weren't about to let some petty HOA enforcement bully one of their own. They came up with a plan. Quiet, calculated, and unyielding. They would pay the HOA's headquarters a visit. The officers wouldn't see it coming, and they would make sure that this was a lesson about respect, about not underestimating the power of those they sought to oppress. The day of the planned visit arrived. The team assembled in the early morning, each of them moving with purpose and precision. They weren't there to cause harm, but to make a statement, loud, clear, and unmistakable. John knew what was coming. He could feel the weight of it, the air thick with the anticipation of the confrontation. As they rolled up to the HOA headquarters, a nondescript building on the edge of town, John's mind raced. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every person who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or made to feel less than because of who they were. This wasn't just about his violation. It was about standing up to years of systemic injustice, to the kind of oppression that had been allowed to thrive under the guise of authority. The doors to the building swung open as the team made their way inside. The receptionist froze, her eyes wide with confusion, as she recognized the men entering. Not your average visitors, to say the least. John stepped forward, his posture steady, his eyes fixed on the inner offices. The HOA executives had no idea what hit them. The confrontation wasn't loud or chaotic, but the message was clear. John and his team weren't there to argue over trivialities. They weren't looking for apologies or explanations. They were there to remind those in power of something simple. You don't get to walk all over people, not anymore. As John spoke, his voice calm but full of conviction, he could see the unease spread across the faces of the HOA officials. Their arrogance was replaced by discomfort, then fear. They had underestimated him, assumed his silence meant submission. But they were wrong. You think this is about a trash can or a lawn? John's voice rang out, steady but filled with power. This is about respect. This is about dignity. And you've just crossed a line. The team didn't need to say much. Their presence spoke volumes. As the executives shifted in their seats, trying to regain control of the situation, it was clear they were no longer in charge. The tables had turned, and the very people they had sought to suppress were now in control of their fate. The confrontation at the HOA headquarters didn't end with shouting or violence. In fact, it ended with something much more powerful, a silent acknowledgement. The executives, faced with the truth, knew they could not simply dismiss John and his team as troublemakers. They had crossed a line, and they knew it. The following weeks were filled with noticeable change. The HOA backed off from targeting John, their claims growing weaker with each passing day. The official paperwork was submitted, the threats too. John's property were quietly erased, and the once assertive enforcers of the community's so-called rules now looked over their shoulders, careful not to step out of line again. But it wasn't just about John. The community began to shift. Word spread quickly about the visit, about the men who had stood up for one of their own, and how those in power had been forced to reconsider their approach. People started speaking out more, no longer staying silent in the face of small injustices. John's peaceful home was once again a sanctuary, but it was more than just a house now. It was a symbol. It represented the fight against oppression, the refusal to remain silent when faced with injustice. It was a reminder that sometimes it's not about following the rules, but about making sure those rules are just. John didn't have to say much in the end. His actions spoke louder than words ever could. He didn't just take back his peace. He inspired a community to stand up and demand the same. and the message was clear. No matter where you come from or what you've been through, you always have the power to change the world around you. As the dust settled and life began to return to normal, John sat on his porch, looking out over the quiet neighborhood. His past may have been filled with wars, but his future would be about peace, not just for him, but for anyone who needed it. And as he watched the sunset, he couldn't help but wonder, how many more people are out there, waiting for the right moment to stand up, to speak out, and to change their world?